Thanks so much. Shout out to the stenographers, by the way. Amazing work. Yeah, I spent a lot of my early career evangelizing IPv6. We've been deploying it now for 25, getting on 30 years. Did we win? No. There's your answer. See ya. Have fun. I did kind of burn out on it. But looking back, I can kind of see the value now, not just in the raw networking, but in learning how to handle really long-term change. So let's talk about that. And to talk about it, I want to talk about IPv4. If you go to RIPE or ARIN or one of the other regional internet registries where the IP addresses come from, to ask for a block of IPv4 addresses, well, these days you go in a long queue. But in the past, it will come from this. This is what's called the IPv4 free pool. It's measured in literal /8s. A /8 is any IP address that has the same number before the first dot. And let's take about 10 minutes to walk down this. We'll stop in a couple of places along the way for particular moments in the v6 rollout, starting with, why did we do this in the first place? You see, we didn't deploy IPv6 just because we were running out of IPv4 addresses. I mean, yeah, that was a factor, but there's lots of ways to handle not having enough addresses, right? There's loads of ways to do that. Some of them, a lot of them are deployed today. You have deployed a lot of them today. So why do you need a whole other internet protocol? The reason for the new internet protocol was to preserve the end-to-end principle. Okay, Anna, what do you mean by that? Think about this. Why was the internet successful in the way that it was when it was? It's not because it was the first time you could send text or images or even video down a phone line, right? There were ways to do that before. It was the first time that the telecoms provider wasn't in charge of the application layer. Okay, Anna, what do you mean by that? Well, you couldn't, anytime you wanted to connect something to the phone network, it had to be approved by a telco. It had to get a little label on it that said approved by BT or whoever. You couldn't just make your own device and connect it. And even if you did and didn't tell anyone, you certainly couldn't go out and sell it and expect other people to plug it in and then build your network. It didn't work like that. You had to get it approved. And you can't innovate in that sort of situation. You need permission. But once you have a modem, yeah, the modem needs to be approved. But then you can deploy your own application. As long as you make sure your data is split up into packets and have little headers on them and is sent out, then you're deploying software, and other people can deploy the same software or compatible software, and then Tim Berners-Lee can sit down and go, right, I'm going to take port 80. That's how you get that sort of innovation. That's why things took off the way they did, when they did. And that works provided there is no middle box which needs to approve what you're doing or needs to understand the protocol. Because how can you deploy a new protocol if all the bits in the way also need to know those protocols already? One of the other prerequisites is it relies on having enough addresses to go around. And I really, really thought we would have been done with that in 30 years. There's probably not a single piece of equipment on the internet now that, that was there 30 years ago. Our next stop is 2001 by way of 538 million years ago. I like to think of technologies as having a Cambrian explosion phase, where there's loads of cool ideas, and some of them are really out there, and some of them work out, and some of them don't, and things settle down. This is called a stromatolite. It's sometimes called a living rock. And they were kind of a big deal before the actual Cambrian explosion, and then the environment changed, and the circumstances for the formation weren't really there anymore. In the 90s, I think we were in that phase with IP, particularly with IPv6. There were all these cool out there ideas on how to do IP right. We made some mistakes first time around in the 70s and 80s. We're going to do it right this time. We had ideas maybe we could automatically renumber all the addresses in the network every night. And to my mind, the end, as a networker, the end of this phase came in around about 2001, because that's when some of the wilder ideas, like weirder DNS records, got deprecated. Ideas like, let's all have geographical routing so that we keep the routing table really small and routers will be really cheap. That kind of went away, it was abandoned. The cool experiments that didn't work out were kind of shaken out. And the production deployment by 2001 was really properly starting to get underway. Things settled down, and at that point, the free pool had about 120/8s left in it. That's loads. That's like over half the usable address space in v4 land. And we knew v6 was going to end up looking more or less like v4 did, with some improvements. And that's okay, because there's still improvements. Now we'll go to 2007. And this is the sad part, because this is when the bottom kind of fell out of the story for us. At this point, there's about 80/8s left in the free pool. And Jeff Houston, who was the chief scientist of APNIC, stood up at a RIPE meeting. RIPE is the big meeting twice a year for all the European internet providers to get together and coordinate things. And he said, we've blown it. These are his literal slides from 2007. They're on his website. He calls this the train wreck talk. Every slide has a picture of a different train wreck on it. And his point was this: our mental model at the time for how the transition would go would be we would deploy v6 and it would build and build and build, and we would slowly replace v4, and eventually it would be kind of all of the internet before we ran out of v4 addresses, and then we kind of just slide the v4 stack out from under there and we'd be done. And he pointed out by 2007 he had run the numbers and it was impossible. If we were to pull that off, it would be the biggest engineering project the world had ever seen. It wasn't going to happen. There's going to be a question mark phase. And we don't know how long it's going to take, but it's probably going to be a while. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but it's probably not going to be what we imagined. The plan had to change. The goal had to change. There's one more point we need to visit. And that's today. We're out. The internet didn't die, but there's no v4 free pool left. The point of IPv6 was to preserve the end-to-end principle, and that's gone. The point was to avoid this scenario where everyone had to go through gateways and translators and proxies, and you had to get like approval and permission or support in order to deploy new protocols, and that can't be done anymore. It failed because of the competition. I think some of us didn't really get that there was competition, but there was. It was a network that was already there. It was v4. It was the installed base of operating systems and kernels and TCP stacks and server software with a really, really solid, robust, mature software base. And that was really hard to compete with. And at the same time, when you're really in the center of these things, it can be hard to see like the outside perspective. Private addresses have a whole load of problems. If you come to the office hours, I will talk your ears off about the problems just in terms of like tracking down abusive behavior. But there's a way, depending on how you look at it, that they do give you a measure of independence. The model of cloud deployments these days is everyone basically has their own gateway. And when you're looking at it from that perspective, does it matter what you deploy, what protocols you deploy behind that, as long as the gateway supports them for you? So why do we still do this at all? We aren't where we hoped to be, but we still have these problems to solve, and we know how to solve them. The solutions are out there. They are being deployed. We know that like network address translation and proxies and things like that, they do work. But we also know that the more the internet grows, the more pressure is on those boxes, those devices. So we're already taking a whole bunch of pressure off them today. Google publishes the proportion of the traffic that is IPv6 And it's nearly half these days. It's big. That's an awful lot of pressure. Like any network engineer will tell you, half of a Google is a lot of traffic. It's a large proportion of your traffic. And that is a lot of pressure that is not going into ISPs, NAT gateways and proxies and things. And that reduces the cost and the unreliability of having to operate those things. So we know that that's helping. And we also know long-term, this stuff still needs to happen, because the more you rely on those things, the harder it becomes, the more expensive it becomes, and the less innovation you can actually have. I also know, realistically, it's probably not going to be done by the time I retire, and that's still a couple of decades away. But it's a sort of change that people will look back and wish we had done. And that kind of brings us all the way back to the mid-90s. We didn't get now where we wanted to be then, but we'd be in a far worse place now if we hadn't tried. It takes longer than you expect. Incremental improvement is okay. The goal's going to change. And the industry is old enough now that it's sensible to think of lengths of time longer than one career. That's all I got. Thank you very much.